Hey everybody, thanks for coming back to the Xanadu Review. My name is Prester John Anders, but you just call me PJ. Well, today, like any good podcaster, I have a friend who's a doctor. So I have my friend Dr. Mateo here. It's a pseudonym we're using for him since he is an actual real doctor, folks. You can believe me. But me and Mateo have been friends for, we childhood friends going back years and years. Kind of, like happens a lot of times in life, you lose connection with old friends from childhood. We reconnected a couple years ago, and we've had some interesting conversations, and Mateo is a fan of the podcast, and he thought, it'd be good to talk and get some of this out there. So all that having been said, I really appreciate you coming on, man. This is going to be a lot of fun. You want to tell my audience a little bit about yourself. We'll get into this. You haven't gotten into writing on Substack quite yet, but like your life, the work you do, stuff like that.
Sure, yeah. Hey, PJ, thank you so much for having me on. This is just really fun to be able to have these conversations spontaneously. I feel like we had these conversations even when we were younger, just in a
Lower
much
level.
less mature, yeah, just a little bit lower.
A lot more calling
But,
each other gay and stuff like
yeah,
that.
a lot of calling gay, a lot of watching Revenge of the Ninja, doing very strange dances. I don't really remember, well,
Yeah.
yeah, there was some stuff there, but it was good times, man. Our childhood memories are some of my fondest memories growing up, and I'm really grateful for them. But talking about me, so yeah, you can call me uh Dr. Mateo, or online I'm Salty Wavelength. Haven't quite started posting on Substack, but in general, so I'm a pediatric neurologist. I'm just finishing up my training down in Houston, Texas, and my primary interest is in what we call rare and ultra rare diseases. So diseases affecting a very, very small portion of the population. Generally speaking, they're considered undiagnosed, or conditions that are affecting, there's debating numbers, but somewhere less than 20,000 people in the world, often affected due to genetic causes. But my primary interests are in a group of diseases that are considered mitochondrial or metabolic disorders, meaning that they affect the way that your body metabolizes energy. And then the other set of conditions that I'm interested in are a group of diseases called leukodystrophies, some that people may be familiar with on rare chance are Tay-Sachs disease. It isn't really a leukodystrophy, but it getting in that realm where it causes neurodegeneration and devastating consequences. But there's actually a lot of hope in the world of genetic research in antisense oligonucleotide therapy and all these really cool emerging gene therapies. That's been really exciting, and that's the part that I'm most interested in, actually. As far as kind of background goes and everything, like we said, I grew up actually up in the Midwest, and had a pretty conservative background. My parents and your parents, we all went to the same church, and they raised me in the faith, and it was a really sincere faith. My parents really did encourage me to ask questions, even from an early age. And so, at least for me, I made my faith my own fairly early, but it was still an immature faith, and I don't think that was really challenged or tested on an individual or on a philosophical level until I got to college. But at any rate, I was heavily involved in school, and ended up going to a small liberal arts school in Iowa, and then back to our other location in the Midwest for medical school, and then back down here to Houston. I'm just finishing my last year of residency, and following that, I'll do an extra year in neurogenetics. And then I've actually accepted a job up in the Pacific Northwest that I'm really excited about doing. So, doing, I guess. I'm not sure. But what else do I need to share?
No, I think that's all good stuff about you, and I think it's a good jumping in point, since I think one of the most interesting things, and you touched on this, one of the most interesting things I always enjoy about our conversation is, in a lot of ways, we're very different people in our personality, world outlooks. Our upbringing was in some ways similar, but some ways very different. And I was just thinking, ever since, we were best friends at like probably like what 12, 13 is when we first met, something like that. So,
Yeah.
A good 10, 15 years ago for, depending on when exactly that was. It's I think
Yeah.
I don't want to do the full early life, but even back then, like you're like, yep, I want to be a doctor, and almost 20 years later, here you are, where I was much more never knew I wanted to do, still kind of don't. I like being able to be agile and do lots of things. I've gone from being a chef to now I work in tech, and I might make another jump again. Choice pending, but so all that having been said, it's something I always enjoyed about our conversations recently, because as I said, like you came from a very different background and very different personality type. Like I've told my listeners, my dad was a pastor, so if pastor sons, like usually like goes one way or the other. You will either zig and you completely are super Christian, or you zag and you go the other way. And I know that definitely caused some friction with less when I was younger and going through my edgy atheist phase. You were much more conservative. I was much more liberal, but we're still able to remain friends. But, we didn't exactly have a falling out. Just,
No.
I moved somewhere else, you moved somewhere else, and we reconnected. But the interesting thing to me is when we did reconnect, we kind of ended up finding ourselves meeting in the middle, both politically, religiously, etc. And I just kind of want to dig into that and see what you think about it, and like what your journey was like. Because to me, I was, we were raised in I guess it was what, Church of Christ or non-denominational. I think they varied back and forth, but it was a very like kind of like an evangelical offshoot, very like, I don't know if you remember, but there was like we had like one of the elders come in and do like the evolution isn't real talk and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I was very like edgy atheist, Richard Dawkins, Marilyn Manson, all that stuff as a kid. And you were much more, I say this as a compliment, more straight laced, more focused. But there's a general like the term people use now is the vibe shift, where I feel like there's a lot of people who are changing. So I feel like you've become, in some ways, a lot more liberal and measured and nuanced in your faith, and I've become in some ways more conservative and much more open to faith and Christianity in general. So what are your thoughts? How did you come to that? Because you can tell more if you want, because I remember we would get into arguments / debates even when we were young teenagers about this stuff. And it's interesting that we've kind of come to a good middle point with them.
Absolutely. Well, so to be honest, I think that those early debates and discussions, they actually really honed my desire for those conversations. So I think, even being as straight-laced and kind of focused on just whatever goal I was setting out, whether it was being a doctor or my faith, I found that those conversations stimulated me in a way that I don't think was necessarily there from other conversations. School was fine, but it wasn't forcing me to engage with other ideas in a real way. And I actually remember one time we had a conversation on creation at church, and you actually weren't there for that. And they were talking about the plants, and I raised my hand and I go, hang on, the sun wasn't around until the fourth day, so how did the plants get energy? And this was this question about a literal 6 days creation versus a figurative or metaphorical sort of story. And I think in some ways that just there's always been a little bit of a skeptic's heart in me, and not necessarily for faith per se. I've never had a walking away from the faith moments or anything, but what it was, I think part of it is just naturally growing up and being exposed to different ideas and different ways of being. I think part of it, quite honestly, is trying to engage with personal and modern. And this is a hard question, actually. I think I think coming up with personal challenges and finding the answers that I received as lacking, I think kind of forced me to be more open to new ideas and to challenges that it allowed me to hone those things. I'm sorry, that's a terrible answer, but I think politically what forced me towards a more liberal position, I guess, I would still call myself conservative, but not in the modern sense. Growing up, as you may recall, I was very pro free market, pro like let rah, nothing the conservatives do can be wrong. Bush, Bush, Bush. It's kind of disturbing actually if you think about it. But but I think what forced me into it was I started adopting some more libertarian positions because I saw that I saw freedom as the chief aim. And I think that was actually oriented towards the idea of what is going to produce human flourishing. And in that case, when it comes to human flourishing, I thought freedom itself was the end. And then I realized that that kind of forced me towards the question of, well, is freedom the end? Or is freedom a means by which we achieve that? And so that shifted me from more libertarian positions to more liberal positions, but then also kind of tempering that with but there's still personal responsibility to a degree. There's still elements of like, what are my social obligations? How does that require me to do something? And I can't be unfettered from my context and my being. And I thought that a generally more conservative viewpoint allowed for that. And then simultaneously, you can't ignore the fact that for a long time, traditional Republicans have ignored the science. And I don't mean Fauci science, I mean actual hard-hitting science of like, hey, this is what the facts and the data support for human flourishing. And that's ultimately what I want for people. And yes, I think that my faith informs that. I think that at the end of the day, I do want people to share my faith, but I also know that as a child, I could have rammed those things down your throat and you would have spat them out, vomited it on me, and hated me for it. Not you specifically, but just
yeah, I get it.
Yeah, but knowing that I wasn't this totally autonomous being that made decisions on his own. I think that actually informed my faith as well. I started reading a little bit of Nietzsche. I read some of the other existentialists like Kierkegaard. And that actually forced me to reckon with some of those questions about faith as well. I don't know. It's a little bit of a rambly answer.
No, that's actually kind of perfect. I sometimes joke that this podcast is for the ADHD community. It's we ramble, and we ramble here, folks. We love to ramble. So all that to say, much in the same way, I was very, very liberal, much more libertarian, and I don't have to go into all the specific. Interestingly enough, reading some of the same people, Camus, Derrida, people like that, and or Zizek, people, the deconstruction side, and I think it's very easy and also understandable from the more liberal leftist side to go down the deconstructionist path. And I think that was something, again, informed my faith, because I had maybe a slightly different relationship with my dad being a pastor, that I rejected faith much more strongly because it was not something that I could escape from. But in that same way, like the deconstructionism of faith and religion to some of the presuppositions of Western civilization, and there, I think, and I stand by many of them. There's, you can't deny, for example, the history of racism in America, at least definitely towards like Black people and Native Americans. I think it gets more and more complicated the farther away you get from that historical context relationship. But the way that I started becoming in some ways more conservative was philosophically kind of thinking, okay, there's only so much deconstruction you can do. And if you're going to have the goal, kind of like you said, of human flourishing or freedom, flourishing is kind of a relative term. It's dependent on cultural context. freedom, but freedom to do what? And I started questioning some of these fundamental presuppositions that I had, and started to recontextualize them. So, and much in the same way, I started to rethink faith and outside of, and I'm still not a Christian. I'm a lot more open towards it now, and I want to talk about it more because you've been one of the people who's been instrumental in like re-examining faith. At the very least, I'm not an atheist now. I guess you could say agnostic or culturally Christian agnostic, whatever you want to say. But re-examining also learning the history of Christianity and some of the assumptions that I had, because, and I'm sure we'll get into this too. There was like this in the 2000s, like the new atheist movement, where it was presented like, science and progress was this, force just always bubbling under the surface that religion and the Catholic Church were just holding down oppressively, and that's pretty ahistorical. And there was a give and take and an evolution there. No pun intended with evolution. And outside of the, very like, and this is something I stand by, and we've talked about this, privately. I want to do it on the pod and hear more, but like, I still think American Protestant, like post-war Christianity is pretty spiritually bankrupt for the most part, and there's a lot of good stuff with it, but like, your Joel Osteens and stuff like that is, and it's hack to talk about mega preachers, but even in that, like, smaller context, but that is a very, very narrow view and expression of Christianity that's not necessarily historical. So I don't know, long-winded answer, but a lot to go on there though.
No, absolutely. I think it's, so I just want to touch back on that point of the deconstruction components of faith and everything. And I think that there's actually a healthy way in which that happens. Even if you are somebody of faith, and as I said, I myself would claim that. I would claim a personal relationship with an actual God, the one of the Bible and the person of Jesus. But at the same time, it's an ignorant faith. Like we're told to have a faith like a child in the Bible, but that doesn't actually mean an unexamined faith. What do children do more than anything is they ask why. They ask questions, and that's actually not an unhealthy thing. So I think that that's one of the coolest and best parts of our relationship, is that we've always been people who ask the why question. But going back to that question, or that comment about modern evangelical spiritual bankruptcy, I actually think that you're 100% spot on there. I see that as one of the reasons why a lot of evangelicals that I know are moving towards traditional forms of worship, Catholicism or Orthodox. And, there's the meme of the ortho bros and everything, but there's a true sincerity to a lot of it. And that, that's not discounting all the astroturfed, like trad life kind of stuff. That's not what I'm trying to
Christian LARPers and whatnot.
Yeah. Like, I mean, there is a sense in which people are trying on identities, and that includes a Christian identity. And I'm not begrudging anybody who's doing that sincerely, but I'm talking about the grifters who are all doing it because it's trendy now, or it's making them a buck. But at any rate, but it's like at any rate, I think one of the things. So examining our our church was technically non-denominational, but now Church of Christ. It was rooted in Church of Christ, and one of Church of Christ's thing was this idea of, quote, nothing but the Bible, and that was actually in some ways being unfettered from the past actually kind of moored us in some very weird dead ends. I think, and I go, well, how can you even get to a modern understanding of sin, for example, without, confessions from Augustine? Or how do I think about what it actually means to be a Christian without thinking about the Nicene Creed or how the Bible was organized? These are real and important questions. And so I think the unmooring from history is actually a result of the influence of the modernists and ultimately the postmodernists And I'm not trying to rail against them here right now. I'm just trying to point to the fact that there's this unshackling from the past that and context that actually removes meaning and removes purpose. And I do love what Jordan Peterson has said, is that this idea that meaning is actually the network or the filter through which we see reality, and without meaning or purpose, that actually takes away from our experiences. So we wanted to see, on the much more atheists side of things, you have this idea that the only thing that exists is material reality. And you can get into some weird hedonics. You can also get into like esotericism and other strange things, like trying to discover the nature of reality, or even to a point as a religion. But on the other side, you have this thing where you're totally shackled into absolutely, what did the church father say? Well, I'm like, yeah, but Martin Luther also thought like the Jews needed to be like executed. So like, there are problems there too. And so I know he's not like traditional, but that's about as far back as
I see what you
we
mean,
can go.
right?
Yeah. So I think one of the healthiest things that has happened as far as the modern church, we don't have to talk about Joel Osteen. We don't have to talk about, like you said, mega churches. I think there's healthy, vital things in the evangelical movement. But what I have been seeing is everybody has been, when evangelicalism, which is very much based on emotionalism and based on, well, this feels right, listen to the Holy Spirit. There are some valuable things in that, such as reemphasizing that in the Christian faith that God is 3 in 1 and the Holy Spirit is a part of that. But returning to a sense of, okay, but where is meaning and value derived from? What are these good things that we left behind? And so actually the church that I attend now is much more liturgical than previous churches that I've attended. I attended a church in Milwaukee, actually, that they, for the first couple of years, it was really solid, but it was very laser lights and seeker friendly is the term, the Christian faith. And I thought it was so cool, but I came back for a visit and it had turned into glorified TED Talks. And at one point they had even said like something to the effect that like, you don't really need Jesus to actually get a benefit from that. And that just seemed completely antithetical to the historic church and the deep and abiding meaning that had been created and developed over thousands of years at that point.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what I meant by the spiritual bankruptcy of it. And not to make this like, a childhood struggle session, but something that always bothered me about the church that we grew up in was, and not everybody, but there were certain people there who would very much politicize the pulpit. And to me, like there's, for example, like, it's more or less a settled issue now, but as you know, one of the issues at the time was gay marriage, and you could make the argument of, being against it or for it. There's more like the, what do they call them, like UCC, and there's some people are more pro, but to me, and that's kind of what, there's so little said about it overall that you can mention it, but it shouldn't be like a main talking point. That's kind of, and it's funny, years ago when we started reconnecting, you're like, yeah, you probably like orthodoxy just because my personality is very all or nothing. And part of what draws me to orthodoxy is it's like arguably like more conservative than the Catholic Church, and not conservative in like the, not just, I mean, it is as well, but like the American social context of liberal versus conservative. It's conservative. Like this was arguably, according to them, the first form of Christianity in like the Byzantine Greek side, and it hasn't changed. It's just, this is what it is. You come to it. It doesn't come to you, which is interesting that you see this wealth of specifically young men who are going to Catholicism or Orthodoxy. I think for that reason, because there's something else you touched on was when you were talking about the TED Talk Christianity, because I remember like when we were growing up, like it's like, it's religion without spirituality. And there's something that also, the more I learn about the history of religion, or Christianity specifically, is that there's always been this dialectic, like in even in the Hegelian sense, between, and I was referencing, like, the Orthodox Church, that this existed in a very specific time versus the Western Roman Church. There's a dialectic there to Martin Luther and Protestantism. Like, these all existed, not just spiritually, but like with the material conditions. And this is more, I guess, leftist talk of, the Martin Luther and Protestantism arose in the cultural context of people becoming literate and the Bible being translated into English, German, what have you, in the printing press, where you could like just print them and give them out, and just like this hugely socially destabilizing technology, not unlike the internet or AI is right now. And the every single, or like the Anabaptist, or some of like the absolutely insane shit that went on in the Middle Ages with some of these, like you think the Mormons, or some of these snake handlers now are crazy. If for the history buffs in the crowd who knew about like some of the things that went on in like the medieval era, it would, it's not even touching it. So all that to say, like, this is something that you touched on that really resonated with me, is this really specifically that post-war American evangelical Christianity that, like you said, it's trying to be just the Bible, no frills, no fills, which on its face sounds good, because, and I think I've said this to you before, like, that is something that, even when I was an atheist, I feel like that religious framing never really left me. Like, it's just the facts, it's just the science, it's just XYZ. But be it Christianity or science or medicine or history, you can't remove these things from context. They have to have a context. And I think that's why, to me, like modern American, like mainstream Protestant Christianity, it's like, it's bifurcated on the culture wars. It's either like, because I remember you mentioned like the TED Talk Christianity, or I was driving recently in my city here, and I saw it was like the electric lights, and it went on the sign, and it went from like the LGBT flag to, let's celebrate Asian Pacific Islander History Month with a quote from George Takei, and just, one of those generic, we believe the science things. And say what you will about any of that, and I think there is something to be said about how wokeness is like secularized Christianity, but they didn't mention Christianity in any of those things. And I think on their face, a lot of those things can be good. At least, being more inclusive, which is something that you could say within Christianity, but you're not actually talking about Christ. You don't want to scare off people from church by talking about Jesus. Whereas I've seen some of the more conservative churches where it's all fire and brimstone, getting mad at gay people, feminists, trans people, God and Emperor Trump can do no wrong, and above all, we must support Israel at all costs. And that's this weird bifurcation that I feel like turns people off. And interestingly enough, like those, like, from what I've seen of the numbers, like those types of Christianity are just hemorrhaging numbers, whereas the only ones that are growing are like, Orthodoxy, Catholicism, conservative churches that aren't weird cultural stuff, and like, Korean churches and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, it's that's funny that you mentioned that. I think about so just going back to the comments about orthodoxy that I mentioned a while back, to you, I think the other thing is that those more conservative, Catholicism, orthodoxy, more, I don't want to say apolitical exactly, but apolitical, for lack of a better word, churches, that there is, there's a position, but that's not the point, right? And I think for, at my church, they have a list of positions on a whole bunch of different things. And so, for example, when Roe got overturned and everything, the first statement that my church put out is that, hey, we acknowledge and identify the glory of each human life. And if you are frightened or fearful, or this impacts you in some way, we want you to know that this is a place in which we want to explore those things with you, and we want to know that you are loved first. And it wasn't wishy-washy, it wasn't compromising on what they believe is true, but it was acknowledging that there were people at the heart of this. And I think that was a very tender-hearted kind of position. And I think that at its heart, I think, is actually going back to the gospel and back to what faith is. There is a place where we have to acknowledge, at least in the Christian faith, that we have to acknowledge personal responsibility for sin, that there is, ultimate consequence. And if there's an all-loving, all-gracious Father, then nothing can separate us. Like you said, like inclusivity is a good thing, right? That doesn't mean you compromise on what you believe is true. It's actually fundamental. People respect you more. I hate to play the whole, oh, I have gay friends kind of thing, but I have gay friends, gay colleagues, and we've talked about faith, and they actually appreciate me more because I stand firm in what I believe in. Like, yeah, you don't agree with those things, and we're sitting down to a meal and enjoying one another's company, and we're going to have a valuable and healthy conversation around that. And it's not oh, let bygones be bygones. It's this, you want somebody who has the courage of their convictions, whatever those convictions actually are.
Yeah.
I think that's been one of the healthiest things. And going back to this whole like TED Talk Christianity, the religion without the spiritual, or you get into this weird territory where the religion is exactly what what the Protestant movement accused Catholicism was, which was empty ritual apart from the actual deep meaning. The only difference is that my particular brand of Christianity is wrapped in a therapeutic language that makes it a lot more palatable to most people, and that was disgusting to me. It actually made me like sick to my stomach. I have friends who left. Left that church for the very same reason, is that they were tired of therapeutic language and this idea of a wishy-washiness. They wanted something more firm and more real, especially in both of us being millennials. And I hate to bring up the millennials have survived so many crises and everything, but we have never been in a period of relative stability where in post-World War II America, there was a place for modern evangelicalism to kind of put its claws into things and allow you to have that therapeutic language. And that isn't, like we said, that isn't to say that there wasn't some good that came out of it. There are sincere actors who wanted to share the gospel because God had changed their lives. And that is not to be missed, that it's valuable. But I think that you also miss out on the richness and the depth of what faith can mean to people and how it can inform people's lives. I'm a much happier person because I started taking my faith seriously instead of treating it like this sideline activity.
Mm-hmm. And that makes sense. And I think there's what it makes me think of, to slightly shift gears, is I think that there's this lack of integration in the American spirit, ethnos, whatever you want to call it, because the opposite side of that is kind of more what I came from. I don't want to harp too much on that it's became such a cliche right now. I didn't leave the left left me. Like in some ways I have become more conservative, but I found like there was, and I'm far from the first person to point this out, but and the wokeness almost feels like another great awakening in like a religious context. If you're familiar with historically,
yeah.
Just in case, for the audience, if you're not, like, historically the United States has had like 4 to 6, depending on how you want to look at it, religious reawakenings, revivals, where there's these periods of ups and downs. And that's what it feels like to me, because I remember what struck me. I saw the other day something somebody posted on Substack. It's this video of this woman. She was at this protest, and they were protesting Tesla stations or dealerships, which, putting aside how silly it is to harass people making $40,000 a year working at a car dealership because you don't like what Elon Musk did, I remember seeing that it was all older people and women. There were virtually no young men there. Um, and the only time you really see young men showing up in these leftist protests are when they're like rioting and burning shit down, which I feel like speaks to like that young male spirit where, for better, for worse, we need something, not that women don't, but like in that physical sense, we need to do something, we need to be a part of something. And if there's not a healthy version of it, you know, either it's not that the right hasn't done this either. There's, violence and burning stuff down. But the fact that, when it's viewed and people are putting their faces out, it's all these like older people, mostly women. And it makes me think like that tends to be like the strongest adherence to church. The stereotype of church lady exists for a reason. It's and I don't say this like punitively towards women or the elderly, but if I don't know if you've read like Camille Paglia, she talks about how there's no her rough quote is like, the reason that there's no female Mozart is for the same reason that there's no female Jack the Ripper, because women tend to enforce social boundaries and men tend to test them. And we have this again, like even on a gender level, this weird political bifurcation where nobody wants to talk to each other. I've sometimes called it, it's like, middle school dance room, gender politics. Everybody's just standing at opposite ends of the gymnasium. And like, it just seems like it's antithetical to growth. And that's what I see either in like these leftist movements that become very like school marmy and very judgmental. It's like, it's another type of like, spirituality, or like religion without spirituality, or like it's like religion but without redemption. So it's, a lot of people like myself have been pushed away from that, but I don't, I have a hard time trusting the recent convert, like, I got canceled and I used to be a they them blue haired communist, but I got canceled. Now I'm a right wing based red pill. Like that, it's too much of a change. It just feels inauthentic. So I feel like a lot of people feel unrepresented in this time and culture. And I don't know. It
Absolutely.
sounds like you've experienced that a little bit from the other side.
All right. So yeah. So I think coming from the more conservative side of, we certainly had our fair share of school marms in the church we grew up in, and whether that's a gender difference or not, there's probably some of it just based on inherent biology and everything, and that like you said, that idea of reinforcing social norms and versus pushing them. I don't know if I've necessarily had too much of that in my own personal life, but what I have noticed is that there is this tendency in that any social movement needs a robust combination of the people who are going to enforce and reinforce the tradition, the values, and those people who are willing to execute on those things. And then simultaneously, the people who are going to push and ask questions and actually allow the church to evolve and to grow. And I think that when you have a healthy social organization, whether that be a church or a social movement, you actually have a healthy dialogue sort of between all three of those actors, the people who are going to execute, the people who are going to reinforce, and then the people who are going to push boundaries. And I think you can get to sort of a healthy norm in that regard. So I guess like for example, in my own church, we are a pretty healthy church body now. And, we have our pastors who are very visionary in the sense that they're like, we are here to execute on a plan and to lead well. And then they have a women's council who are there to help kind of put the bumpers up on the lane in some ways. And then we have other people in the church who are like, what about this new way of approaching things? How are we actually dedicated to serving the poor? How are we actually committed to the things that we claim that we're committed to? And that's been a really healthy place to be. I think, what you see what you see on the left, unfortunately, to a large degree with some of those movements is, I think about BLM and, the less that can be said about the idea that leftism, or not leftism, excuse me, but wokeism as religion without the spirituality. I think that enough has been said on that. But even so, you have like BLM where they were they would dedicate the marches to their ancestors. I'm like, it's literally the oldest form of worship in that sense. But you look, and I recently read Children of Men, the book, not the movie, which great, well-made movie, but misses the point entirely. But in that book, Children of Men, there's these women who carry around baby dolls, or they carry around their cats or dogs in like very elaborate strollers and literally treat them like babies, because people can no longer have children, and they're trying to fill this maternal role within themselves, because that is inherent to them. And I
fur babies.
Yeah, fur babies. And I don't have a problem with people caring for their pets or anything, like fur babies and everything. I think that there's something sweet, especially as, people, particularly women, want something to care for. But this had become pathologic in the book, where people would literally hold up a baby doll and be like, isn't my baby cute? And it kind of gives the main character this sense of horror. And I think that is in large part because we've stripped a lot of goodness and meaning from the context of the individual family. Like, I don't speak for all women, but many women find much value in their small community of their family and maybe close friends and maybe their church. And so I think in some ways, wokeism is actually an attempt to try to recapture some of that, in the sense that they're trying to reclaim and protect these marginalized groups in many respects. And I think that actually is one of the things that I find as a common point between some of my woke colleagues and everything, is that I can say, hey, you genuinely care about these marginalized people in a way that I, to be frank, don't, because I am more concerned with my people. And it's this outgroup bias, and that isn't to say that I'm a heartless person. For goodness sake, I take care of like very sick children. But it's like,
I get it. Did you see? I'd have to find the source, but there was that study where they did asked people who are like more liberal, temperamentally liberal versus temperamentally conservative about where their in group is, and like conservatives, like you said, tend to be more like me, my family, my immediate community, and the farther it gets away from that, the less empathy they have. Whereas liberals, it was kind of the opposite. We're like in the abstract of, people. I think I've heard people quoting it, talking about like rocks and trees and stuff, which environmentalism. But there is like this. It feels like this misplaced maternalism or paternalism of the abstract of a marginalized group versus like the actual person who could be, problematic / a sinner. But I think that's because I feel like I am temperamentally more conservative in that way, that I'm pretty in-group, out-group motivated, like my immediate friends and family, and that will include people who are like, not like me in the tribal sense, but, they're, race, gender, sexuality, but I see them as like in my tribe, the social sense. So I'm a lot more I would say temperamentally conservative, although maybe more like culturally libertarian, although I'm kind of moving away from that, as for reasons I mentioned. I think there are limits to rugged individualism, but that kind of reminds me of something else I kind of want to touch on there, since some of the things you've said, and even more recently, there seems to be an inflexibility to the cultural left and liberalism that, as you remember, like, when I was 12 years old, I didn't like cultural inflexibility when it was Christians and conservatives, and I don't like it now when it's a total inflexibility of liberalism. Like, for example, one of the issues to me that seems like, like overwhelmingly, for example, like trans women in sports is overwhelmingly unpopular, even with like 60 some odd percent of liberal identified people. But
Mhm.
there's just this, and to me, like, and as somebody who broadly supports trans rights, okay, what percentage of the people in the world are actually trans versus what percentage of them are athletes, and what percentage of that group is good enough to be even performing in professional sports at that level. To me, that's such a small group of people that the classic Star Trek line, the good of the many outweighs the need of the fews. Take that small L, and because optics wise, to me that seems bad, but there's just, it's, and not everybody, but there's like this complete cultural inflexibility and refusal to accept compromise. Whereas on the other side, right now, I see the right, and conservative is not the right word, because what's the old joke, American conservatism is liberalism driving the speed limit. But broadly speaking, the right seems to be evolving and a lot more dynamic right now. And I'm wondering what that's like to you. And you can talk about this as much as you're comfortable with, but we've talked about how like your parents were initially like, not on, so up on Trump personally. And I know a lot of conservative Christians who had the position of, personally, I don't like Trump, but he's moving things in the right direction. Say what you will, the Trump movement, and we've talked about, I'm more open to JD Vance and that brand of conservatism than I am for Trump. I still think he's kind of a buffoon, all things told, even if he's a pivotal historical figure. So all that to say, that's my signature, very long-winded question. What's it like? Because all of my, I have one friend who's turned more conservative, but where I live right now, pretty much all my friends are liberal. I live in like one of the bluest districts of one of the bluest cities of one of the bluest states. My finger is not on the pulse in that in real life. And what that's like to you, because you mentioned like, the LARPer Christianity and stuff like that, but even as a part of the dialectic, that change, because, and we'll touch on this more broadly, but even the crunchy movement going from a liberal thing from when we were kids to now it's conservative coded. So with all that dynamism there, where do you see that going? What's it like, etc.?
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question, honestly. I think it's interesting that dynamism has evolved. People like to talk about the pendulum of American politics swinging from conservative to liberal, and I don't strictly agree with that. I think that there's also like a ball being passed back and forth, and it's the evolution ball. I think, if you had talked to conservatives 20 years ago, kind of in that Bush era, Bush Obama, I'm terrible with dates and everything, so you got to forgive me on that. But you're looking, and Republicans are the ones that look like they're very stuck in the mud, and Reaganomics, and oh my gosh, deregulation, when oh my gosh, it probably didn't work. But now that ball of Trumpism or populism has moved to the conservative side. I think politically, I think the jury is still out how and why that happened precisely. Maybe there's some inklings in the Tea Party and those sorts of things, but even that feels like a failed movement. I think that really it may have been believe it or not, a grassroots sort of political experience. I think that a lot of conservatives, at least the ones I'm surrounded by, were looking around and they were like, wow, it's actually kind of miserable to be a bug person, to be in the pods and to eat the McDonald's and do the usual, I want my Hummer, I want my X, Y, and Z kind of big, loud, giant house. And they realized that they were miserable in it. And maybe some of that is just growing up. But I think
And also
the way
that
I've
it's not
seen,
economically viable regardless.
yes, that's very true. Is that, like I said, boohoo millennials, but we've been through a lot of financial crises, and we realize that the answers both on the liberal side and the sort of traditional conservative side were not solving problems, that something drastic had to change. And I actually think that it could have come from the left as well. But in general, I think that conservatives temperamentally are a little bit easier at letting bygones be bygones to a point. At least, well, you know what, that's not necessarily true. But at any rate, I rewind on that. But where I've seen it affected most in conservatism is actually in that crunchy movement. In that crunchy cons is kind of the term that was it was coined by Rod Dreher in, oh gosh, early 2000s. I had to read a book for college in a class on the concept of a manifesto, and it was this idea of, well, since when is taking care of the environment and caring for your family well and making sure they get a good education, since when is that a liberal talking point? Like, isn't that just a human talking point? And so, you know, when there are microplastics in all the food, and when your skincare is literally poisoning you, for the ladies, probably the men should be too, but you look around and you go, that's not flourishing, that's not healthy, it's not good. And so strangely enough, we were just talking about school marms, but the people that I've been seeing that are the most gung-ho about these things are the younger women who are like, I'm tired of feeling like crap. I'm tired of being told that I'm crap, and that they want to push for those things. And then the men see that as sort of a dating market pressure, and they say, yes, this is actually really good. Let's go build a homestead in the middle of nowhere, and I'm going to learn how to fish and hunt and all these sorts of things. And I joke to a point, but I'm surrounded by a group of outstanding men who are of that mindset of what is going to be good and healthy for my family, what is going to be good and healthy for society, and not even just I think part of it might be that expanding of the circle, right? We said that conservatives temperamentally are focused closer on family and tight social values. I think it's a return to community and communalism that has been really good. I've been blessed by having an outstanding community. And I think having those close social bonds actually predisposes you towards, caring for the environment more, caring for food and health safety, and being, anti big pharma. And who would have thought that true blue conservatives would be the ones that would be anti big pharma, if you had looked 10 years ago, even before COVID. And now,
Obama era was probably where it shifted. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's something.
Kind of
put a pin in COVID, because I want to get to that.
Yeah.
But it made me think of, well, I would say probably around the Obama era, and there's a piece I'm working on, kind of workshopping, about the concept of conspiracy theory as folklore, because I know a lot of people who are like, not dumb, not even like conservative versus liberal, because I think it has to do with relationship to power, essentially. And I think people who are not dumb but are not educated or informed, they'll see, there's a difference in between like what the stated reality is and what their lived experience is, and you got to fill it in with something. And in previous ages, it would have been folklore, mythology, like the example I use is, if you lived in medieval France and 1425, and you think, oh, if I leave out a bucket of milk, it goes sour because there are little pixies that will come in and do that, because that's what they do. And technically speaking, they're wrong, but broadly speaking, they're correct, because that's how bacteria works. So that having been said, I think like the shift that I saw was, we've talked about trust the science, and the science, capital T, capital S, TM science. And I feel like, when we were kids, that was more, I don't think conservatives ever said that specifically, but it was implicit, right? Because they felt, rightly or wrongly, depending on your view of history of the 20th century, so latter half of the 20th century, that they were in control. The liberals were the insurgent party. I personally have come around differently on that, but that's neither here nor there. So like, okay, these institutions of science, we can trust them. But right around the Obama era is when I feel maybe it was people aging out from earlier generations. Maybe it was, I don't know if we talked about this, ever ended up reading Curtis Yarvin, and he talks about the cathedral and how, we had the liberals and doing the long march for the institutions. But at a certain point, it became from an undercurrent to an explicit, like, yep, these are liberal institutions, even things that should be neutral, like science, have an open ideological bias. And there's a lot to be said about the whole not trusting the science as if the science, again, TM, is this liberal ivory tower that is not unlike we were talking about with religion, totally devoid of cultural context and being corrupt. I mean, if you look at the replication crisis, or, if you look at the funding that goes into different studies and how that will, pretty transparently steer the results. I think that's part of what we see with the crunchy movement, right? So because it went from when I was when we were younger, it's like, oh, you don't want to eat McDonald's and hyper processed food. What are you, some kind of queer? To like,
Yep.
Come on, trust the science, Chud. According to this recent study, funded by Monsanto, it's actually okay to eat airheads for breakfast. And if you don't, you're actually being fat phobic, because some people are neurodivergent. Can only it's the same shit, different toilet, so to speak.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and it's, gosh, you touched on so much there. I think about like Francis Fukuyama and the end of history and all of this. Like, yep, we solved human flourishing. We solved that these institutions are actually all supposed to be liberal leaning. They're supposed to, trust the science and all of these things. And I think what that misses is, one, none of these people who were writing the history of the last 50 years were actually versed in science. There are so very few scientists, true scientists, that are contributing in a meaningful way. And if you talk to real scientists, the first thing that they'll say is that they have to come to things with a humility of, we don't know. And science being an actual framework for asking questions, but not necessarily for creating meaning, I think is where we kind of got into an unhealthy place. Yes, it can inform our meaning making, but like you said, with the replication crisis, for example, where it's like, well,
sorry, do you want to explain what that is, just for the listeners who may not know?
Absolutely. So it's true across all sciences to a degree, but the replication crisis as it stands is that there has been a significant and severe inability to replicate the results of psychological and sociological studies that have been conducted in the past. So what I mean by that is science is based on repeatable, verifiable phenomena and measure of those phenomena. And replication means that I can do the same experiment with the same exact conditions every single time and get the same results. And granted, there's a bunch of funky math that goes on at like the quantum level or things like that changes some of these things. So I'm not ignorant of the fact that we can't control all circumstances. But for example, a study might look at exposing 10 people to frightening imaging, or 20 people to frightening imaging, and 8 of them have an acute stress response. And if you reverse the images, does it change their response in some way? And say I get, 8 of 10 people or 8 of 20 people respond in this one study. I do it another time and only 2 respond in that time. And obviously these are poor numbers, but it's this inability to get the same results given the same conditions, which makes the results of those psychological and sociological studies very suspect in terms of their scientific validity. And so,
sorry, quick to jump in here and then go back to it. And my understanding is this is when you could probably know the timeline better than I have, but this is within the last 20-ish years or so, my understanding, and that's when they moved away from replication crisis to as like the the replication for a scientific study to peer reviewed, which is inherently like an appeal to authority, essentially. Like, this other journal has reviewed it. So jump back in, but I think that's
Yeah.
an important context.
No, no, absolutely. So, peer review there is something to be said here. So peer review has its utility, in the sense that, so biologic science has, generally speaking, been very peer review oriented, and hard sciences such as, physics, chemistry have almost always been, replication based. Though biologic science did have, replicable things, especially when you're talking about, biochemistry, molecular biology. Those things actually do still need to be replicable. But when you get into the realm of the mind and, psychological realities, or you get into something as complex as neuroscience, which is one of my areas of interest, being a neurologist and whatnot, people will talk about, well, these certain areas in the brain respond, if you're conservative versus liberal, and they'll do that same study, a year later, 2 years later, 5 years later, and the results don't hold water. So there's no, validity between experimenters. And part of that might just be the fact that we're not controlling for all of the conditions. And part of it, might be that the experiments are just poorly designed, because quite frankly, we've been pumping out PhDs in, the more squishy sciences, psychology and social sciences, like clockwork, and yet we've made no progress in the hard sciences, who have also moved to a peer review system, which is its own can of worms that I'm not qualified to speak on, quite frankly. But just, going back to that idea of the peer review and everything, that literally becomes an appeal to authority. It's the trust me, bro, this happened. And
Source,
that's
trust me.
literally, and that's literally antithetical to the worldview of science, which was, hey, I'm going to present these things before my peers who can understand them fundamentally, and I want them to poke holes in it, because that's how things advance. Like,
With the expectation that there would be replication. Is that the case? I'm asking.
Either expectation of replication or expectation of, applying those in another context and seeing if they hold water. So it may not be the exact same experiment, but the idea, say in physics, is if I discover one thing, it's a building block. I should be able to apply it into another context. I should be able to apply that same model to this other phenomenon that I'm experiencing. And if not, that must mean that there's either something wrong with our model or something wrong with the experiment. And when we're doing science really well, the model gets refined. When we're doing science really poorly, the experiments are the ones that have to be refined. I think about, for example, so in the irony of talking about religion, in biology, and there's this idea of something called central dogma. And central dogma is DNA makes RNA makes proteins. And quite frankly, it's just not that simple, but that was the old adage. And HIV threw a wrench in that, because it actually has a special protein called reverse transcriptase, which takes RNA and it converts it back into DNA and integrates it into your genome. And that's really strange and really weird and cool. And it challenges our preconceived notions. And we found out that RNA is functional in many other ways. And it's not just the proteins doing the jobs, that they actually interact. It's one of the awesome things that it's allowed us to create treatments, using antisense oligonucleotide therapy and other gene therapies. So it only changed because the model evolved, and because those preconceived notions were challenged by the scientists or challenged by nature itself, and we discovered those things. And so now in the social sciences, you have all of these things that, well, that men's brains are like this and women's brains are like this, or conservatives' brains are like this and liberals are like this, or even, you get into, all sorts of, people will always make this decision. They talk about like philosophical experiments, and you can kind of simulate some of those experiments. I think about the Stanford prison experiments, and that's horrible.
Pretty widely
science.
discredited now, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it's still used in our textbooks as an example of like those sorts of conditionings and about human cruelty to a point. But it's horrible science, and I think when you get to that, it starts poking holes in things, and then scientism as religion. We all got kind of sucked into that. At least I definitely did. Even
Mhm.
being
No, I did for
you
sure.
know yeah, being a conservative Christian, growing up, that I got sucked into it because I was like, this is such a powerful explanatory tool. And yet I forgot the whole heart of science is to continually ask questions and to be curious. And it's actually people like, Sam Harris did a lot for my thinking, quite frankly, as a younger man. But he's bought in whole cloth to that idea of scientism and was just so anti actually asking questions. Not to mention he's a bad scientist, but that's besides the point.
Well,
But he,
quick quick side note about that, like he's all something I only learned within the last couple years that like um Sam Harris, I mean, A, he's a Nepo baby. His mom was like the
yep,
producer of the Golden Girls. B, like now he has a degree in neuroscience, but he did the majority of his work like Maps of Meaning was his major one. Is like within like the last 10 years I think he got a PhD, but he had like a degree in like English or philosophy or something. So
yep,
his
yeah,
there's between him or like the fact that like Neil deGrasse Tyson hasn't published a paper in like 20 years, and he was like
yeah,
not Chat Aquarium, the something planetarium, Shea Planetarium or something like that.
yeah, yeah,
He
yeah.
was like a glorified tour guide. He's a great science communicator, but there's so
Mhm.
many people who claim the mantle of scientist that to me it feels like in the same context that you would like claim the authority of a priest. Like
Yes,
your
yes,
actual work is not, if you can get doctor next to your name, like your actual work, whether or not it's relevant to the field you're discussing is kind of irrelevant. I have a friend of a friend who like, she's like, oh, I'm a scientist. So like she has a paleontology PhD and she works
mhm,
part-time for free at a dinosaur museum. Like nobody's
yeah,
come, it's cool, but nobody's coming to the paleontologists to cure cancer,
yeah.
or
It's
COVID.
it's the joke of the joke of the airplane. Somebody's having a heart attack on an airplane, and they go, is there a doctor on board? And the cultural anthropologist says, I'm a doctor. you know,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, yeah. It's
So
not. It's yeah.
yeah. So, quick question for you then, because I think that's a good lead into one of the main topics I wanted to talk to you about, vis-a-vis RNA, which is probably a good teaser for what I want to go. But as a prerequisite question for that, when you're talking about the overproduction of degrees, either in the hard or soft sciences, it sounds like it's disproportionately towards the soft sciences when there's the overproduction, and if maybe you could speak to this better, an underproduction of the hard sciences. People like Elon Musk, or I don't know, like Mark Andreessen, or some of these, the dreaded tech bro oligarchs that people talk about. But I do think that they have a valid criticism that we kind of moved away from hard sciences and DNA, RNA, and kept development only in software. And there was an overproduction on the other side of the soft sciences. Do you think this, either the replication crisis, any of these, working under bad premises, is a result of just the fact that, I don't know if you've heard of, there's an author called Peter Turchin, and he talks about cycles of like societal collapse. And he says like one of the main indicators of societal collapse is elite overproduction. And that's what he put, he says like, for example, to backtrack slightly, wokeness is a crisis of elite overproduction, because when there's not enough positions to fill, you need to find ways to move up in the hierarchy and the ranks outside of the work itself, because there's only so many positions. So be it the soft sciences having a outsized impact, maybe that they shouldn't have, or and again, you could tell me if it's an overproduction in the hard sciences as well or not. Like, what is the function there? Because or is it just the funding? Like, the combination thereof? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, yeah. So I think there's a lot at play here. I think that absolutely that there's sort of that elite theory going on, that there's something to be said for the overproduction of elites, and that isn't to say so. Some of the smartest people I know in the entire world don't have advanced degrees, and that's not to be like, oh, you don't need an education. You need to be educated, but that doesn't mean that the letters behind your name mean anything. I actually usually introduce myself simply as my first name, unless I'm in my clinical
Mhm.
context, because I think it puts a barrier of separation that I don't actually want. Yes, there's a place for that authority, but that's a side point. Um, I can't speak specifically to the hard sciences as far as overproduction, like physicists and mathematicians. I would argue that there's probably an underproduction of, I don't want to say useful, but meaningful contributors to those fields. Primarily just given the fact that the rarity of having an IQ capable of doing the work that's necessary to push that work forward, or just having the mind, is just such a mathematically rare event that by definition, universities want to keep those departments open. And the only way they keep them open is by having funding and by having undergraduates and graduate students doing research. And so there are financial incentives to keep those things open. So maybe there's an overproduction, but an underproduction of actually useful contributors. I'm not an expert in those things, and I don't want to feign. Humility is one of my core values, and so I don't want to feign that I know much in that area. There is an overproduction of PhDs in the biological as well as the soft sciences. Like, there's just a bunch of nonsense research, and I'm not even trying to get into the James Lindsay kind of stuff where he made fake academic papers and things like that. I'm just talking about, like, why are we wasting money on some of these things? And in reality, I'm not even talking about the let's study this obscure mammal in the Amazon rainforest. Some of that can actually be truly useful. I'm talking about the follow the money sort of things. Why is Monsanto paying for this? Why are these big agribusinesses and big pharma businesses paying for these studies and not these? Shoot, you look at studies on heart disease, and the American Heart Association, which was funding many of these studies, was being paid by the sugar lobbies so that they would suppress research into the causes of actual heart disease, which is not dietary fat as far as we can tell, but is almost directly related to sugar intake, particularly refined sugar. So, like, that was literally suppressed by the AHA, and you can look up the papers. It's not a conspiracy when it's actually true. So I think that there is this issue with the overproduction of elites in those social sciences, and part of it is simply that we got really bored of doing hard manual labor, that we got really bored of doing meaningful labor. Part of it is because you can't afford to provide for your family in a lot of these blue collar or lower white collar sorts of jobs. And I mean that in, like, the most charitable sense. Like, I have a friend who is an electrician, and he is brilliant. And he's like, I did not want to go to college, even though he was more than capable of getting an advanced degree. And he's perfectly happy doing that,
He probably makes more money than your average college degree and no debt.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's happy, and he has free time, and he can care for his family well. And I think that, like, putting all of those things together, part of it is just creating all of those PhDs is a response to market pressures in a lot of ways. I think you spend more time in skill incubating, and then you have an excuse for why your life hasn't quite turned out the way that you wanted it to. It's sort of a fear of flying. I think I actually admire you in that respect a lot, because you just kind of went for the things that you were passionate about, and I thought that was really cool growing up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's funny you say that. I'm considering leaving tech and going into psychology, actually, but we'll see how that actually lands. But in any case, I think you, depending on how you're doing for time, there's at least one more topic I want to get to you with, which we've kind of hinted at, two if you have the time. But I think we've been kind of dancing around the C word for a while, which is, being COVID in this case, because the two things that really struck me are, A, when you talk about funding, and I'm pretty COVID agnostic personally. I didn't even have a strong opinion on the vaccine until I still don't have a particularly strong opinion on. I'm agnostic. That having been said, at the time, because at the time when COVID happened, I was working and I was in the tech field, and don't want to be too specific to dox myself, but I was doing, like, technical support And I managed a lot of different doctors' offices and did their IT. So okay, you got to get the vaccine. Like, oh, okay, I didn't really think about it because I wasn't very online at the time. I didn't know there was a debate around it. But later on, there are things, people talk about their red pill moments. I've had a number of red pill moments, so to speak. And there are a number of things that just really rubbed me the wrong way about how COVID was dealt from. We talked about the trust the capital S science to the changing of the messaging from, be it on both sides too, from, the Democrats and Nancy Pelosi saying, don't do masks, it's racist, go hug a Chinese person, to, wear the masks 10 feet apart. And I'm curious, and we'll get to that in a second, to how effective you think it is as somebody who actually works, the 10 feet apart, all that stuff, cloth masks, etc. Or, from Trump going, it's the best vaccine. I created the vaccine. You were going to love it too. Now, the vaccine was bad. Like, it's just such mixed messaging to, we've talked about this before, the way that it was like the CDC put out a tweet of like, don't take ivermectin, y'all. You're not a horse. And like this cutesy bullshit that they were doing for, and again, like, I don't think that ivermectin cures COVID, but it's a very effective, like, I believe, antiviral medicine. And it's like the 420th most prescribed medicine in the world. The guy who created it got a Nobel Peace Prize. So like stuff like that to me, there's just so many moments where, and the going between like, we're doing 2 weeks to more and more to some of the very obviously dumb rules that felt like, almost religious ritual of, okay, you got to wear your mask in the restaurant, but you can take it off to eat and the germs will be polite to, you can, okay, you can't go to church, but you can protest. Like, it was clearly so asymmetrical. So that's something that bothered me, and a lot of people who I knew, even who were more liberal, like, I don't know about that. So I'm curious to your thoughts on funding, like how effective some of these techniques that people were trying to push were, the vaccine, and specifically the RNA side, because when it comes to the hard sciences, like I took like high school biology, and that's about it. So I know that, what is it, the powerhouse of the cell, and that's about as far as I go. So a lot to do. Yeah. But what were your thoughts on that? Because I know you said you were vaccine hesitant at first, basically because there wasn't long-term research on it, and then there was, and you felt more comfortable with it. So what are your thoughts on that more broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to be said, or I want it to be said too, is that something for Big Pharma. I don't think that all Big Pharma are bad actors by any means. I think that legitimately there are good faith efforts there, and that's not because I'm funded or anything. I do have cards on the table. I do have a study with a drug company for a migraine medication going on right now. I just want people to know that. But it's not. When I say that, I think that part of it is just institutional inertia and trying to continue to generate profits. So setting that aside for just a moment, we don't even have to talk about like bad faith actors, though there are definitely bad faith actors. COVID. I think that at this point, nobody can dispute that men had contribution in creating that virus. It was not from a wet market in Wuhan. It was from a lab that Fauci funded. I don't think that I am wrong in saying that, but I'm going to put allegedly just to cover my butt there.
Fair.
Still, but at any rate, what I saw is that COVID did kill a lot of people. Okay, my friends. So I'm not an adult physician. I'm a pediatric physician, and thankfully, COVID didn't seem to affect children as hard as adults. But if you look, then the majority of COVID deaths affected the people that we would expect it to affect: people who were chronically ill, had chronic lung disease, obesity, metabolic problems, and the elderly. And it's kind of who we expect to die from something like the flu. Now, would it be wrong to say that it was just a flu? Yeah, it would be in the sense that it was much more severe. We didn't know what we were dealing with. We know what coronaviruses are, but we also didn't know, how transmissible it was, how dangerous it would be, or any of the long-term effects. And so I think that initially some of the precautions were fairly reasonable. Let's give it 2 weeks. Let's see what's happening. Let's quarantine at least for a little bit. But what happened is that these became, like you said, like religious rituals. And so when I got suspect, when I noticed that these were starting, COVID was kind of starting to follow a seasonal pattern. And I told my friends this, that I thought, yes, it was devastating to see all these people hospitalized, but honestly, it wasn't any worse than some of our worst flu years. If you guys remember, there was like swine flu that went through when we were growing up. And it was I don't want to say exact numbers, but from a cultural memory standpoint, it seems like it was about as bad in terms of the people and the number of getting
Bird
sick.
flu or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody's worried about like avian flu and everything. And we've had SARS in China and those sorts of things. So these things do happen when you're living in a modern metropolitan world. But that said, I think that the response to COVID became wholly inappropriate when we started treating these things as if they weren't something that we have to learn to live with, and instead became a new normal, became a new reality that we lived in. So for example, going into the science, so I have an autoimmune condition, and we can talk about environmental impact and those sorts of things and why that might happen, and maybe at another time. But because of that, I waited to get my COVID vaccine until I actually got there was a position paper published by the American Academy of Rheumatology, and it said that it was safe for people with autoimmune conditions. And I said, okay. And I actually read the paper, but most people aren't able to do that and understand what's going on. Now, that said, I think that the efficacy of the mRNA vaccines with COVID is left to be desired. I think that we were extremely premature in pushing these things, and that there have been negative side effects that people are very unwilling to admit, specifically the cardiomyopathies associated with young men that are happening at much higher rates due to the immunogenicity. If you look, all RNA vaccine research, not all, but a lot of the RNA vaccine research that was being done in animals for decades, for literal decades, always ran into the problem of immunogenicity. And I think from that standpoint, are we really surprised that there's been issues with fertility in women and cardiomyopathy in men? So we can't say that the introduction of these diseases or of these vaccines has been a net positive all in all. I think that if it had been, then we would see more RNA vaccines than we've seen. I think that it's actual. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, this is maybe a good time. And could you explain for me and people like the concept of mRNA vaccines or RNA vaccines, and kind of you talked about is, because to me I'm a total layman with this. Does it actually make significant changes to DNA patterns? Is it contextual? How, broadly speaking, how does that work?
Yeah. So I'm just pulling up a paper for myself just so I don't screw things up, because it is somewhat technical. So the idea here, crap, 1 second. So what you're looking at, so mRNA is messenger RNA. It contains the code for a protein. Another way to think about it is that it'd be something called like a functional RNA sequence. So RNA is like a temporary copy of DNA that's supposed to go do a job, whether that's making a protein or not making, it can make something else, right? And so in this case, what an RNA vaccine is trying to do is you take mRNA that looks like a virus, okay? It looks like the outside of a virus, which is what your body would respond to, right? Your immune system responds to the proteins on the outside of a virus. So you get the code for that, the mRNA, and it's, sorry, just trying to go into this because it's—
No, go for it, please.
So it introduces the mRNA into the host cells. Um, and what happens is that the mRNA, it doesn't get integrated into the host DNA. So you're not making changes to your DNA, but it's sort of encapsulated in like temporary storage so that your body actually, or your cells will actually produce versions of the protein on the surface of those cells and create immunogenicity through your immune response to your own to these self-produced proteins. And so it should be something that would be fairly effective. And I'm to be honest, I'm not a virologist. I'm not an immunologist, so maybe I'm even the wrong person to talk about all the technical aspects. But the idea is that by allowing your cells to produce this particular protein, you are giving your cells a fighting, or your immune system a fighting chance to respond to the protein without the risk of actually getting infected. And so when you actually get exposed to the virus, your immune system is ready. Okay. So in that sense, they function similarly to a traditional vaccine in that you're essentially giving a small dose of something to cause your body to react. The difference is that your cells are not the ones making the thing that the vaccine that you'd respond to in a normal vaccine. You're giving that exogenously. You're giving that directly into the person. In this case, the RNA gets into the cell and you produce that protein on the outside surface of many of your cells. And so you actually get sort of a long-standing immunogenic effect. And so if, for example, you have an autoimmune response to that particular protein, you can get resulting effects like cardiomyopathy or fertility issues, which are a little bit more complex because that protein might mimic some naturally occurring proteins in the body too. And there's only so many structures that a protein can have. They're close to infinite, but there are certain patterns that get repeated.
Interesting. So, and again, this is nowhere even close to my area of expertise. But am I?
Mine either, honestly.
No, I mean, I think you explained it in a way that even somebody like me can understand. And maybe I'll totally discredit myself here. So basically, what I guess, and maybe if you're not the right person to ask, that's okay. But to me, it feels like something that, yes, COVID-19 was deadly for many people, and I don't want to downplay that for the people who lost their lives, who got very sick. I got COVID once, even after I had the first round of the vaccination, didn't get any boosters, and I was it was the sickest I ever was in my life. But it was like 3 or 4 days, and then I got it again this year, and I was like, oh, I didn't even know it was COVID. It was just the flu.
Yep.
That having been said, to me, it seems like this mRNA. I mean, I don't know where we are with the development of mRNA vaccine technology. It feels like like us building a bird house with a sledgehammer. Like it is. I don't know. And again, if you're not the right person to ask, that's okay. But it feels like the specifics of the mRNA vaccine for COVID might have been an over response. Is that like the more credible? Because there's like they're putting vaccine in your blood to give you 5G, and you'll have a MAC address, so that all that stuff is silliness. But it sounds like there are some very credible criticisms of an mRNA vaccine for something like a coronavirus, and the knock-on effects, be it cardiovascular issues or fertility, is that being suppressed? And I know that's a couple different questions, but to me, I'm just trying to wrap my head around this as somebody who's been pretty COVID agnostic, other than I felt like it was an administrative overstep to a problem that was real, but like it was a total over response.
Yeah. So I think that there's a couple of things at play here, as there always are. I think in one sense, you have the issue of those knockoff effects, so efficacy. So we don't know if mRNA vaccines actually produce long-term, and I mean decades-long, immunogenicity to these things. Secondly, coronavirus specifically is a horrible virus to do these things with. because coronavirus is highly mutable, meaning that it changes a lot, and the genetic code changes a lot, which means that the protein structures change a lot. So the flu is similar to that, which is great in some respects from a research standpoint, but from a long-standing immunogenicity, you have to get a flu shot every year, right? Sometimes it doesn't work. The reality is that an mRNA vaccine, which is, it's not integrating into your DNA, but it is making changes to the proteins that your body produces, either it's not going to work or it's going to work too effectively, and we don't know those downstream effects to a large degree. I don't know how much it's being suppressed at this point, but it is clear that there are negative side effects that people are experiencing. And you can say that about a lot of vaccines, and I'm not disparaging those things, but why didn't we try to create a vaccine that was done the same way as a traditional vaccine? One,
that was going to be my
takes longer.
question. Okay.
Yeah. One, it takes a lot longer to develop those things. And two, it can be, you have to find the right protein. You have to make sure it's stable. It really is more of a technical problem. And mRNA offered a quick kind of a quick slapdash solution that doesn't necessarily solve the answer or have the long-standing credibility. The problem is that you can't actually do randomized control trials with vaccines for a bunch of ethical reasons. It's like a key tenet of what we do is that you can't. You really can't. So I think from that respect, there's some really interesting science. And as I was saying, that RNA research is actually one of the coolest and most exciting fields of research right now. So I'm not somebody to disparage the research that was done in these areas. I think that it's really interesting and important. But I also think that at the same time, it was pushed out because of public outcry and because of fear. And I like Trump to a point. But I think that is one of those things where he is very, at least in his first term, more so, he was swayed by public opinion, and he's like, I have to do something. I want to come in as big man, big hero. And I think that actually has caused more problems. One of those problems being vaccine skepticism, but it may not be a problem in the sense that it actually allows us to re-examine vaccines with a skeptic's mindset. Like, why do I have to give my little itty bitty baby a hepatitis B vaccine? They're not an IV drug user or having, anal sex with prostitutes, right? I don't, and sorry, that might be too vulgar.
That's fine.
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
it's fine.
No, like that's the reality. Like, why am I giving my infant child hepatitis B vaccine? Like, if you're high risk or your parents have it, sure, that makes sense. But it does allow us to ask interesting questions. And so you can argue that maybe the vaccine skepticism may in some ways be a godsend. There are some interesting conversations about all the extra things added to vaccines and vaccinations that, we definitely don't have time to get into here. But I would call myself now vaccination skeptic. But that said, like, I am going to vaccinate my children against, I don't have children yet, but vaccinate them against, chicken pox or, polio. But I think that there's a reasonable conversation to be had about some of these things that wasn't had before COVID.
Yeah. Well, that's something that I'm lukewarm on RFK Jr. And I know as a teaser, we've talked about doing another roundtable podcast with you and another friend I have who's kind of a little bit more passionate about this in the health side. But all that to say, with RFK Jr., people are saying he's a, anti-vaccine, all this stuff. And when he basically said what you said is, I'm not totally against it. There's times where it's appropriate, and there's times where it's not appropriate. And there's conversation to be had about the influence. And again, like, I think there's this, when I was talking about like conspiracy theory mindset and trying to, it's almost like a modern folklore to try to explain things. Because obviously, like, you're somebody who is clearly incredibly intelligent and know these things very well, but like you don't want to go Dunning-Kruger and say, well, I have knowledge in this area of science and medicine, so let me make a judgment on this. Because you spend basically not your whole life, but since you were a young teenager starting to work on this, you're like, yeah, you're giving your best effort. Not that it's inadequate, but all that to say, you need to have a very specific understanding of these subjects, and at the same time, you can get too close to them. And I mentioned the Dunning-Kruger effect, and with all that to say, this is very complicated. And is every single one necessary? Should we think the pharma companies are evil and like some of the crazier conspiracies, they're trying to sterilize people for, pick a reason, right? New World Order, etc. That having been said, I think it's healthy to have skepticism about the pharma industry because, again, to backtrack slightly, like that was a lefty thing not that long ago. And it just feels like you're getting backlash because to me, like, there are reasonable questions to ask. And then when people get slapped down on, somebody like RFK and somebody like me who's more agnostic on all this stuff, I try to I'm skeptical, but I try to keep an open mind and not fall into conspiratorial thinking. But you see something like the ivermectin thing or, RFK Jr., that is, being smeared as like some anti-vaxxer, etc. I think that pushes people in the other direction. When you can't ask reasonable questions, and it empowers the worst of people who are just like, yep, it's all bullshit. Don't get any vaccines. The Jews are putting 5G in your blood for the reasons that they do things. Who can say? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not worried about 5G. I'm worried about 6G. Yeah. So, kind of getting back to that conspiratorial thinking, and I'll put my own biases here. I have a tendency to like mythology and folklore, and so I find
it's fun.
It's fun, yeah, it's really fun. But then you can get into some really weird territories where, like, you get into strange areas of Substack, and you're like, the Holocaust didn't happen. And you're like, oh, that's an interesting conversation. But besides the point, I think that people like RFK. I actually like RFK, one, because he has his cards on the table. He tells people who he is and what he had done in his past and things like that. And I think that that's honest. And I want good faith actors to be able to have those conversations about, well, are the vaccines causing problems? Are there things that we're not paying attention to? Okay, so I don't know how familiar you are, for example, with the history of the vaccines cause autism conversation. But
broadly speaking, I know what's her face. Jenny McCarthy was like one of the main proponents. Jim Carrey did it, and there was some kind of study in the 90s that I think has been discredited, to my understanding. But you could probably say it better than I could.
Yeah, so there's the famous study, or infamous at this point study, is it's called the Wakefield study, and it has largely been discredited that these children who were exposed to vaccines got autism and those that weren't, or what have you. I read the study for a medical anthropology class in college, and I honestly, I don't really remember the details too much, but it was a really small sample size to even begin with, which is suspect, suspect in its own way. But the problem is that it's not an unreasonable question from a biology standpoint. The brain is really complex, and if we're thinking about neurodevelopment, fat is actually a huge part of the brain developing, and nutrients and energy metabolism, and vaccines, because they affect immunogenicity, which we also know has a huge impact on brain development. It's not an unreasonable question to ask, and I'm not saying vaccines cause autism. Please don't. That's not what I'm saying at all. But because the science was bad, and because it got the first science was bad, nobody was allowed to ask that question anymore. The question of autism related to the stability of the lipid membrane, the phospholipid membrane. The phospholipid membrane is sort of that outer layer of the cell. It's what keeps the cell separate from the environment. And fats are really good at keeping things out. But what that looks like is that you have a phosphate group attached to a long fat tail, and then another one, and the fat tails they like to kiss. They like to be close to one another, and but they sort of float on top of each other. It's like a raft, or like a rubber raft, kind of two of them kind of moving and shifting through on water. So this is really, it's really unstable, but you have things like cholesterol and proteins that keep these things stable. And we're discovering that there may be some relationship between the stability of that membrane and autism, which would be interesting because we know from other research that endocrine disrupting compounds, such as those found in forever chemicals like plastics and whatnot, actually do disrupt cholesterol synthesis and stability of lipids and cause all sorts of hormonal problems. So there's some really interesting data there that is worth researching. But I would love to have that roundtable with you guys about just positions on healthcare and vaccine skepticism and all of those things.
Yeah. So the last thing I kind of wanted to get to you on, because that was highly technical and definitely fascinating, but this is kind of related, but also a little bit woo. So that'll be fun to end it on. So we've talked a little bit about in our private conversation or on this podcast the bifurcation of science and religion and spirituality, and we've talked about this specifically a little bit. There's a lot of research that's coming out now about science still has yet to solve the problem of human consciousness, and the seemingly uniqueness of human consciousness, and that's something that religion has typically dealt with in the past. So, and you've talked about the concept of faith, and the value of faith, and not wanting to necessarily have well, actually, when the Bible says 7 days, it was they'll war game it out to being the 7,000 years fallacy, or what have you. That having been said, it does seem like there could be more of a synthesis between religion and science, vis-a-vis the issue of human consciousness. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, because I believe I sent you the podcast I did with Carlos from the Europos YouTube channel, and he was talking to me about either philosophers, psychologists like Carl Jung have talked about the collective unconsciousness, and there's seemingly more and more evidence for something like that these days, or even the concept of aliens, and something like Jacques Vallée talks about aliens and demons all being angels, all being the same entity essentially, and there being these culturally specific expressions that you'll see, because if somebody encounters the divine, they can't really conceptualize it. And that's something that I find interesting, and that's the way that it's kind of squaring the circle for me of multiple different world religions and the diversity of experiences that people have even today with the divine or the spiritual, whatever you want to call it, because that's a concept that I find very interesting. That say you take the story of Moses and the burning bush, and this was essentially a time in the Bronze Age where you could have the more sci-fi, the straight up religious version where it's that's God and that's the form in which he chose to reveal himself, or you could have the sci-fi version where Moses was having an alien encounter essentially, and that's the form it chose. Whereas to me, this synthesis, and this is something that I find interesting, that it was God or a larger entity that exists, and it was trying to communicate with Moses, but the human mind can't really, and human consciousness can't really conceptualize these things. That's why you have the concept of, and even the meme now, the biblically accurate angels, where be not afraid, because we can't conceptualize it. So our minds will look at something like that or try to interpret this experience in a way that makes sense to you. And in if you see something that you totally can't conceptualize, if you're a Bronze Age sheep farmer, you're okay, it's a bush, but it's not burning even though it's on fire. It's just trying to conceptualize something that's impossible on itself. So to me, it's an interesting way of looking at both the problem of human consciousness and religion, some being, or past to God, past to divinity, being better than the others. You know, it's say, you know, Christianity is objectively better than, you know, the Mayan or say the Aztec religion of blood sacrifice or many other forms of paganism. But what are your thoughts on that? Because I know it, to me, on its face, it seems like something that it's not insulting to Christianity, or, you know, any other religion, but it's also not this pan, you know, there's lots of paths to God, man, kind of hippy dippy thing. So what are your thoughts
Yeah.
on that? Does that make sense to you? Does that track?
Yeah, so I think I think for my part, I actually want to go back to your point about Maya and Aztecs. I'd agree Christianity is
Mhm.
better than those things, but I
Mhm.
actually don't think it takes away from the idea of blood sacrifice. That's
Mhm.
a maybe a topic for another time. Uh, just the depth at which some of these things are rooted in human tradition, but or you know, spiritual reality.
Mhm.
But kind of besides the point. Um, I don't think it's insulting. I think that it's um like truth seeking in a really earnest way. I can't personally say that I necessarily think that it's aliens, but spiritual
Mhm.
entities I could certainly
That's kind of what I was
agree
getting
with.
at.
Yeah,
Spiritual
yeah,
entities that we can't
yeah,
conceptualize, that, you know, we don't, we,
yeah,
just for clarification, then finish up that, like, in,
yeah,
you know, the Bronze Age, that would be, you know, the
yeah,
burning bush, or, and, you know, the later versions of angels, that's something you conceptualize. Whereas in the modern
absolutely.
age, that's what Jacques Vallée says, like, you know, especially in the context
Mm,
of the 40s, 50s, 60s, like the religion, the religious imagery was less important, or less, like, you know, culturally resonant. And
mm,
aliens and sci-fi, if you see something you can't conceptualize and understand, the human mind will
mm,
fill that in. Or like, even as going back as like in ancient, you know, Celtic Europe, like the fairy phenomenon, has a very like the exact same beats as an alien abduction. So just for clarification, I'm not saying God is an alien, it's just our understanding.
yeah, absolutely. So, I think one of the hardest questions that I've had to wrestle with in my own faith, honestly, is sort of Cartesian philosophy and this idea of mind-body duality. Are you your mind? Are you just your body? Are your mind and your body one and the same? And I think that the personal conclusion that I've come to is that your mind is the interface, or is the substrate by which your soul, your spiritual existence interfaces with reality. And that's something so it's still very Cartesian in that sense, but that doesn't mean that the soul isn't something interactable. The spiritual isn't real in that sense. Perhaps maybe another reality to take a more, or another dimension to take a more like secular approach. And um, I think it's a really interesting question that, quite honestly, Christianity doesn't really answer or address. If you look at traditional views in, like, not modern Judaism necessarily, but historical Judaism or Christianity, there wasn't really a distinction between the mind and the body. It was actually sort of an integrated whole, but like could be distinguished into parts, but that you weren't, without one of them, you weren't the whole thing, right? C.S. Lewis is fond of saying, you don't have a soul. You are a soul and you have a body. And I think that's kind of an interesting take. But going back to these questions about, you know, encounters with the divine, you know, historically, I do think that they were interacting with something real. And I think that is a very honoring way to assess questions of faith and religion. Like there are too many similarities between the religious encounters of multiple religions to deny that something is going on. And you know, for my own self, for my own faith, I would say that there is one true God, and that those other things are other spiritual entities. Call them angels, call them demons, call them what have you. And that, yeah, as a human, as something with a finite mind, there is a limited ability to comprehend those things in a meaningful way. But I think that's probably actually all the time I have for you, except for maybe your last question, PJ.
No, that's actually a great answer. And to end it on, I always ask, so what's something in the world right now? You know, the world's kind of crazy, gloom and doom right now. What's something that makes you feel hopeful for the future?
Well, I would say that right now, my the thing that makes me really hopeful for the future is I keep referring to my fiance. I just proposed to her 3 days ago. So,
Congratulations.
I
Glad it went well.
yeah, thank you very much. So, right now, I'm just hopeful for my personal future. I get to celebrate life with a woman I love deeply, um, and so I'm really excited about that part. And I can't wait to celebrate with you in person at the wedding and everything. Probably not till 2026, but
Mhm.
and then on a more societal level, I think the thing that gives me hope people would call me hopeful, and I think that that comes ultimately from a hope and a faith in Jesus um, as a personal savior. But I think it is really these conversations as people are waking up and asking more questions. I think that there's become a new curiosity, and that's what makes me really hopeful for the future.
Well, that's great. Well, buddy, I really appreciate it. It's been a
Yeah,
great conversation. We'll have to do it again sometime.
absolutely. I will talk to you very soon, and I'm looking forward to catching up with you, my friend.
Yeah. Have a good one, buddy.
You too. Bye.